Hi, Olwetu. Is it okay if I share my screen? Oh, you're still sharing yours. It's okay.
Yes, it's okay. So sorry about
Okay,
that. My mic
thanks.
was another bit.
Thanks so much. Um, there we go. I'm just going to wait another minute to get started, as I'm sure people are still joining. Um, and welcome to those of you who are with us. It's Sue McKenna speaking. I've got a bit of a croaky voice, so hopefully I'm okay. I'm audible.
Very much audible. Thank you for welcoming us.
Thank you. I'm going to get started, but I'll start slow so that if people join us, it'll still make sense to them. Um, Basically, today we're talking about collecting qualitative data rather than analyzing it, although I will just briefly mention analyzing it at the end. And in the next hour, I'm not really going to cover everything to do with collecting qualitative data because clearly that's a very complex issue with much to debate. But I just want to raise a couple of provocations, a couple of issues, a couple of considerations, things that I think it's worth spending a bit of time reflecting on as you go. And most importantly, I'm going to ask you to interrupt me, whether you put up your hand, put a question in the comment, or just unmute yourself. Ideally, you'll put up your hand, but I always battle to find where the flippin' hand gesture thing is. So if you want to and you can't find where to do it, um, just just unmute yourself and start talking because we're not going to cover everything in this hour to do with collecting qualitative data. So if you have come to this session with a burning issue, a real concern, then I really hope that we find time to have a quick conversation about it collectively, because I'm sure that if it's an issue that you're facing, then it's definitely an issue that others of us have also faced in the past or will face in the future. And so yeah, let's dive in. I'm going to get started. As I say, just raising a few kind of random points about the collection of qualitative data. But I'm also hoping to get some input from all of you. So, of course, the first question is, well, what is qualitative data? And that's seems to be like a really simple question, but actually there's a lot of debate and deliberation about it. And there's a lot of debate and deliberation about what is quantitative data, because I always say, oh, it seems quite easy. The meaning is in the words. Quantitative data is about quantities, and qualitative data is about qualities. Um, but it is, in fact, of course, more complicated than that. So let me start by posing you all a question and asking you to have a go, be bold, and throw in a response in the chat bar in response to these two questions or any aspect of this bigger question. What is qualitative data? What is it that's actually represented when we collect this qualitative data? What is it that we're collecting? Okay, it's words or it's pictures or it's images, but what is it? What is this thing? And where is the truth within this thing, this set of this interview transcript, this questionnaire responses, this video of a class, this painting, all of these things that constitute qualitative data. What is the truth in any of this? So I'm going to be quiet for a minute or two and ask you to be bold and brave, and as many of you as possible, throw in a few keywords or ideas into the chat bar. Great, I can see some responses already coming in. If you're busy typing, just keep going with those and we can have a chat about what comes up. Mm. I'm getting some lovely words here. I don't want to interrupt those who are still typing, so I'm going to wait another minute before I jump in and have a look at some of the responses. Okay, I'm going to make a few comments about what I can see in this chat bar. If you're still typing, feel free to continue. But I think you'll see some really rich ideas here, and I'm just going to draw on a couple of them. One of the ideas is that it is not numerical, so it is any kind of data that cannot be easily represented in the form of numbers. And I think that's exactly right. But we also need to be aware that some qualitative data is given in the form of numbers. And that's always a really tricky thing because oftentimes when we equate numbers to qualitative data, we lose something in the process. So, for example, if I say 57% of people believe that Colgate is better than Sensodyne, that is a number. It's potentially has more credibility because we are primed to this idea that numbers are powerful, statistics are more valid, but actually 57% of which people? And how many people? Did you interview 500? Did you interview 5,000? Did you interview 5 million? And what do you mean better than? Is it better in taste? Better in does the toothpaste work better? Um, who were these people? So it is possible for qualitative ideas like this toothpaste is better than that toothpaste to be captured in a number. So we need to be careful that we don't think that because something's a number, it is not qualitative. So for example, in many qualitative studies, we might use a Likert scale where we say on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all and 5 being absolutely every time, how often do you attend lectures? And then we might say, well, we collected this data from 500 people and the mean average is 3.5. That is still qualitative data, right? It's still not, it's captured in the form of a number, but it's still people's self-reported experiences. And so it is not quantitative, perhaps, in the way that sometimes quantitative means the absolute truth, measurable, definable, objective. Some numbers are subjective, partial. So although it's really easy for us to separate, and most textbooks do this, numbers equals quantitative, ideas, opinions, views equals qualitative. In truth, that can be a little bit, it can be a little bit more blurry than that, because sometimes we use descriptive statistics to represent something that is qualitative in nature. So I think qualitative is indeed very rarely, but it can be in the form of numbers. But more importantly, as many of you have said, it's about views, opinions, perspectives, values, emotions. I'm just reading out some of your words. Perceptions, experiences, and what else? Descriptive, subjective. It's what's represented. Zanele said it's what's represented. And I think that's quite important. So it's being represented to us. It's a person's view of something. Now, is that the truth? Well, it depends on your own kind of ontological position. The word ontology simply means your understanding or belief about knowledge and reality and the truth. So I personally see a distinction between knowledge and reality. I think that what we can gain through our knowledge, through our learning, through our teaching, through our research is as best an understanding of the truth as we can have, but it's never the complete truth, that there are things beyond our understanding, beyond our current capabilities, or beyond our current research tools. So for me, knowledge is always a bit subjective, even when it's very hard science, quantitative research. I still think that there's a subjective aspect to it, but certainly in qualitative research, when we're getting people's views, it's very subjective. It is the representation of something. I'd like to pick up on this idea of truth, because Zanele says there is no one truth, and Tabang says truth is the ability to have a theory. And I think that theory helps us to get to the truth, but I don't, and this is me speaking, and so there are many different views on this, I don't think that theory necessarily takes us directly to the truth, but it helps us move from our ordinary, everyday, biased views of the world, which we would bring to that subjective information that our participants have given us. If we just used our biased, partial, subjective views to look at the biased, partial, subjective views of our participants, we would be guilty of what's known in the literature as a double. I'm just trying to find someone actually described this. Nati called it the description of experiences. And we have to be concerned here that there might be a kind of a double hermeneutics here. And that's often quite strongly criticized. If what you're doing is collecting the views and values of people, and then you as the researcher are imposing your views and values onto those views and values, then all you have is their beliefs, and then it's your beliefs about their beliefs. And that is one of the most strong arguments against, sorry, I see someone's having challenges with the audio. Is that for the rest of you, or hopefully the rest of you can hear? Is it me? You can hear fine, thank you.
Yeah, I'm
So
able to as well.
this idea of a double hermeneutic, a hermeneutic is just the meaning that's given to something. And we all give meaning to our lives. We give meaning to everything that happens to us. We give meaning to everything we see and hear and feel and touch. We always giving meaning to that. That's very much the human condition. But when we interview someone, we are collecting the meanings they have given to a phenomenon, and then we as the researcher impose our meanings onto those meanings. And the argument there is, in the end, it's all completely relative. What's the point of even reading your research if it's just your meanings of someone else's meanings when I might have brought some other meanings? So that's why it's really important that you think through what is the nature of the claims that you're making, and on what basis are you making those claims. If people tell you something about the phenomenon, you interview them about going to church, or you interview them about their views on sport, and they give you their views, how will you be able to say that what I have analyzed in those views is more than just my views of their views? And that is indeed where theory comes in. What theory are you using as a set of lenses to look at that data, which will allow you to make claims that there are certain things in that data, that there are certain findings that have some validity, some credibility? It's worth me reading, because it's not just your view on what someone else's views are, that you've put on these theoretical lenses in order to look through this massive data you've collected, and you're able to credibly claim that there were certain things in this data that are worth knowing. And that's where theory and your analytical tools come in, to allow you to say, maybe this is not truth with a capital T, or reality with a capital R, but that there are things in this data that have meaning beyond the individual participant and beyond the individual researcher. And so you need to be able to make claims about how you're using your theory to make sense of the data, so that whatever you offer your readers in terms of this is what I found, has some meaning, has some credibility. It's worth reading. I'm not just reading. If you just want to tell me your views on someone else's views, I mean, you should write a novel, right? Or you should write an autobiography. But if you're trying to make claims about the nature of reality or the nature of the world or the nature of the phenomenon you're studying, you need to be able to make those claims beyond just, this is what these people said, and I think it's interesting because X, Y, Z. And then something interesting that Kaya points out is the importance of quality and quantity in qualitative data. And we're going to talk about both of those things. What makes qualitative data have quality and what makes some qualitative data pretty bad quality, and what's enough? And unfortunately, the answer to both those questions is it depends. It depends on the phenomenon you're researching. It depends on your research question. It depends on your methodology. But I will come back to that. And just this issue of truth again, Dylan has said the truth is in what the researcher makes of the data they collect. Yes, I would agree. It's the researcher's job to be able to make truth, and you're quite right to put that in inverted commas. Let's rather say to reach findings. But just to say it off their own view, oh, this is what I think, doesn't really hold water in the academic world of making claims about the nature of the world. We can't just say, oh, this is what I think. Unfortunately, we have to say, using these theoretical lenses or using these analytical tools, this is what would seem to be going on in this data around this phenomenon. So it's really important that you spell out not only your research question, but you spell out how you've collected your data, why you collected it in that way, and how you have then, what theoretical frames or analytical frames or tools are you using to make sense of that data. It can't just be, these are the themes that I think are important. And then to pick up Penny's point, I'm not sure that truth is possible. And I think I would agree with that. I don't think truth, well, certainly not truth with a capital T, that truth. I don't think that's possible in qualitative research. Quite frankly, I don't think it's possible in quantitative research either, but that's a conversation for another day. But I certainly think in qualitative research, we cannot claim to say we have now found the answer. This is the truth. But rather we can say, using this very strong tried and tested theory, using these very careful analytical tools, using this carefully collected data, I am able to make these claims in ways that are credible and believable and which help us to understand the phenomenon. So it's a lot more hesitancy in how we make our claims. We're not in the business of saying, this is the truth. I have proven that this is true. We don't even use the word prove. Well, it's unlikely we use the word prove. It's unlikely that we have a hypothesis where we say this is the relationship we expect to find and we test it, because actually in qualitative research, we certainly have our own assumptions and biases, but we try to look at our data with an openness to being ready to see what is in the data beyond our own assumptions and biases. And that's why I would agree with Bridget saying it's an exploration of people's views, thoughts, and ideas. And I do think it's an exploration. That doesn't mean that we fall back into that relativist trap of, oh, this is just my view of what some other people's views are. It needs to be more rigorous, more sound, and you need to be able to articulate why what you are saying you found in the data is more than just your personal views. And that's where theory and analytical tools come in very, very usefully. Thanks, Olwetu, for the suggestion. If you have problems with the sound, we also live stream it on YouTube. That's often better to follow there if you have problems with sound. So we have to be careful of the double hermeneutic. Thanks, Nati, for putting that in there. How do we be careful of the double hermeneutic? So double hermeneutic is this idea that your participants have views and you have views about their views. And then what the hell are you presenting? You're just presenting your views on their views, which is fine if you just want to do that, but it's not research. So that's where we have to be able to look at theory, which allows us to see beyond our everyday biases. But of course, theory also has a history and has its own biases. And so the decolonial scholars, for example, are often challenging us to say, when you put on those theoretical lenses to look at this phenomenon, you are only seeing things in a certain way because those lenses only allow you to see them in a certain way. And that's why it's worthwhile, especially those of you who are at doctoral level, it's worthwhile actively seeking out criticisms of your theoretical lenses. They might actually lead you, those criticisms might lead you to throw away your lenses and choose new ones, but more likely they allow you to think through what are the shortcomings of the theoretical lenses you are using, and how can you speak back to those criticisms, or how can you mitigate those criticisms. So it's something that you often don't want to do. I know when I was doing my master's and maybe even my PhD, when I came across a reading that said that the theory I was using was absolute nonsense and this is all the reasons why it's bad, I was like a tearful mess. Oh my word, I've got to start again. I'm using the wrong theory, because I wasn't aware that in academia there is criticism of every single theory and every single set of analytical tools out there. You're doing a critical discourse analysis, a phenomenologist will say, oh, that's rubbish, you should be doing phenomenology. You're doing phenomenology, and a chat analyst will say, but you should have been doing chat. So it's not to say that you must jump from pillar to post, but do seek out the criticisms and see whether you can perhaps minimize the way in which those criticisms impact on your study, or at least speak back to them or acknowledge them and just say, yes, this is a shortcoming, but there's shortcomings to every study. So yeah, thanks for that. I think hopefully what we've figured out from this first slide is that qualitative data is indeed about values, views, opinions, experiences. Sometimes it can be captured in the form of numbers, but it's still about people's views. So we must be careful. I certainly have always divided quantitative equals numbers, qualitative equals words and pictures and images and so on. And I don't think it's quite that simple, because a lot of descriptive statistics is very much about people's views and values that for simplicity's sake we capture in numbers. And we need to be careful of the extent to which we might lose some of the nuances if we just capture something in numbers. For example, go back to that rather silly example, where if you ask people on a scale of 0 to 5, how often do you go to lectures? If you say in the mean average, you interviewed 500 people, the mean average was 3.5. Well, what does that really tell you? So be careful of simplifying numbers. For example, maybe most of those 500 people you interviewed are clumped around the 1 and the 5. Well, that tells you something interesting there, much more interesting. And that would be that people either go to all their lectures or go to none of the lectures, and very few are somewhere in between. So a mean average might tell you nothing. A Likert scale might tell you nothing. You've been able to capture that in a nice, neat number. Yay, look at me doing numbers, doing stats. I can say 3.5 is the mean average of 500 people. But it doesn't tell you anything about why they do or don't go to lectures, or what their views are about lectures, or what their understanding is about education. And those questions, which can't be easily captured in numbers, might be the more powerful qualitative data to help you answer your research question. Okay, let's move on to how you're collecting your data, because of course there are so many ways of collecting qualitative data. Interviews, probably the most common, but even in interviews, you can have the very structured interview where you have a set of questions that are asked in exactly the same way, in exactly the same format, each and every time. And that's usually used in big surveys like our census every year, where people are sent house to house to collect data. Some of it is qualitative, some of it is quantitative. How many people are in this house? 3 people. Some of it's qualitative. Do you feel that your municipal services meet your needs? That's qualitative. It depends on the views and experiences of that person. 2 people living in the same house might have very different answer to that same question. So, you might choose to have that very structured way, or you might choose to have more unstructured interviews, which is where you have 3 or 4 questions, or maybe even just 3 or 4 topics, and you go into the interview and you want to make sure that you cover those 3 or 4 topics, but really you just want to have a conversation about the phenomenon and let the participant take that conversation where it goes. And then at the real extreme, you can have an interview that isn't really an interview at all. And some researchers really argue against the term interview. And those are often people using Southern theory and decolonial theory who argue that these are more appropriately called conversations, because it's not the researcher who sets the agenda, it's the participant. And you simply explain to the participant what your study is about, and then it's up to them where they take the conversation. Focus groups, it's really interviews in a collective. Just like interviews, there's pros and cons. Interviews, as we will talk about again in a moment, often have big issues around power dynamics, around confidence. You've got to be confident to do a good interview, but not arrogant. And that's often quite a hard balance to get. I found in my experience of supervising students, most of them don't err on the side of being arrogant, they err on the side of being unconfident. And so they're very nervous in the interview, which means that the participant isn't made to feel at ease, isn't made to feel respected. In fact, they feel like they're being interrogated, and it's because of the nervousness of the interviewer. Focus groups have got another power dynamic, which is that normally in any group you have one or two people who are the people who know it all and have so much to say that they silence everyone else. And I'm afraid I recognize that I'm a little bit like one of those kind of people. And you've got to be able to manage focus groups really well to keep those people. Thank you for your opinion. That was really useful, but we've heard from you quite a lot. Do you mind if we just hear from someone else now? I mean, you've got to have confidence to say that. And maybe the way I just said it isn't that good because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I mean, the person who's participating a lot is great. They're there, they're keen, they're interested. But you want to hear from the other people, and managing that can be hard. Surveys and questionnaires, really there's no difference between them. They can take multiple forms. Surveys is generally the term used when it's huge, 500, 1,000, 10,000, a million. That's generally called a survey. And if it's a smaller scale, 50, 100, it's called a questionnaire. But that's just a rule of thumb because I see those terms being used interchangeably or in different ways in different places. Surveys can have a lot of open-ended opportunities for people to write a lot, and they can be closed. They can be completely closed with and that people don't say much in an open-ended question as they might in an interview. But if you want to get through, if you want to access a broad range of people, then surveys or questionnaires is definitely a good way to go. Observations, sitting and watching, usually with some kind of observation chart or form where you've already identified through reading the literature on the phenomenon or through the theoretical lenses you've used, you've already identified what it is that you're looking for, and you have some kind of framework that you can tick things off or note things. But sometimes observations can be open-ended. But what are you looking for? Are you going to be observing every little body movement? Are you an expert? Are you using theory on body language? In which case, definitely you should be noting this person sat forward, this person sat back, this person had their arms crossed. Or are you going to be doing a linguistic analysis, in which case you might be observing, did this person repeat themselves? Did they interrupt themselves? Did they use a lot of hedges? Did they use a lot of emic devices where they so those are the kinds of things you might look for in a particular form of linguistic observation. But what you look for isn't just randomly up to you. It depends on what your research question is and what your theoretical lenses are. And then there's also about workshops. There's also a way of collecting data through action. So this is often very participatory research where you're working with a group of people to come to an understanding of a phenomenon or to try and develop a solution to a problem. And collectively, you workshop that. You maybe you do an intervention. So maybe you go to a clinic and you do some training about long-term use of TB medication. That might be the source of your data collection, is the actual workshop, the actual intervention, where you note the responses to it and so on. And change laboratories is another kind of workshop where you are co-constructing. And there are other kinds of workshops where you are actually collaboratively working to co-construct meaning around your phenomenon. So, and let me give you a few minutes to pop into the chat bar if you're at the stage where you are able to answer this question. Why are you collecting data in the way that you are? So you can write interviews because I want to get to know my participants, something like that. Very short and sweet. What is your data collection tool and why? I'll give you a minute or two to try and answer that question. Okay, while the rest of you are popping in your answers, I hope it won't be distracting if I start talking about them as they come in. Judith is doing semi-structured interviews. So she's got some structure. She knows what she wants to ask, but she's allowing herself the semi part of it, that she can go in a different direction if that's something that comes up. And that's really useful because sometimes something comes up that all your reading didn't prepare you for. And you suddenly think mid-interview, oh, hang, this is important. Let me go with it. Let me ask some more questions. Another good reason to have semi-structured interviews is often people state things as facts, but they don't give you examples. So I find one of my most powerful questions in a semi-structured interview is, that's really interesting. Can you give me an example of when that happened to you? Because people will often say things, well, not often, but they might say things like, my workplace is really toxic and everyone's nasty to each other. Oh, sure, that sounds terrible. Can you give me an example of what that looks like? That follow-up question will often, those examples are often the most powerful place to actually get the feel of that person's experience. And Mandisa is doing interviews and focus groups, getting individual narratives. Now, that's an interesting word, narratives. So that's another kind of research approach, which you could use in combination with others, such as critical discourse analysis, or you could use narratives as both your method of collecting the data and analyzing the data. But narrative has this idea that we create stories about our experiences. So our experiences are not individual anecdotes about things that have happened to us, but rather coherent stories about who we are as we travel through the world. And so using narrative theory, you would definitely want to do interviews and then focus groups because you want a collective perspective on the phenomenon. And that's really interesting. So it might be, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mandisa, but it might be that through the interviews, you collect these rich narratives, you then identify some of the key issues, the key narrative arcs, the key critical moments, and then you have a focus group and you present those findings back to the group and hear the extent to which those findings are echoed. They can give you more depth and more examples, or some people might rebut them. And that can be quite challenging because just because someone strongly says in the focus group, no, that's not what it's like. Of course, maybe it's just that's not what it's like for that person. But you often can get nice follow-up. And I know that that is what a student of mine, Asipe, has done. She's done individual narratives, and then she did some kind of mirror data back to the collective and said, I've analyzed your narratives. These are my key findings. Does this ring true for you? And has had a really rich second round of data, reinforcing the importance and the significance of her data and helping her to see some of her findings with a bit more nuance. Nati, shared experience. Yes, semi-structured interviews allow a bit of flexibility, and questionnaires do allow you to reach many people. Bear in mind, of course, the low participant rate, so you have to think quite carefully about how you get those questionnaires out there. And in my experience, unless the questionnaires are sent out by someone who is quite well known in that community, or who endorses it in some way, or if there's some vehicle by which people who get a questionnaire think this is worth my time, this is, something that's credible. Just a cold call interview gets a very low return rate. Navan or Navan says, I want participants to give a realistic account of their experiences, and I want to encourage reflection. Yeah, I think that's really nice. And I think that's really about creating the space in the interview, isn't it? That make reflection something that's valued, so that the interviewee, the participant, gets the sense that my job isn't to provide you with the information you need, but my job is to work with you to make sense of what I'm sharing with you. So you can structure just through your manner, through the words you use, your body language, the respect you show to your participant. You can restructure it in quite different ways. You can make it clear to the participant, hey, I think it's amazing that you are doing this and this and this, and I really want to hear your experiences. Let's just have a conversation about it. Or you can have it, I've got this set of 5 questions. I'd love to hear your views. Or you can say, as you know, I'm speaking to you about XYZ experience, and I'm really hoping that through the prompts I give you, you might be able to reflect on why this experience has come to mean what it has for you. I'm just making this stuff up at the top of my head, so I'm not sure if it all makes sense. But it's very possible to do interviews in very, very different ways and for very, very different purposes. Shilani says, looking at interventions, assessing the impact of calculation strategies. Okay, so, trying to assess impact. Now, of course, impact is actually, I suppose if you want to see the impact of the calculation strategy, you'd have to actually observe it happening. But sometimes you can't observe things happening. And so instead, we can ask people, do they think there's an impact? And we need to remember, as I said earlier, that we are always collecting experiences, views, perspectives. We are not collecting truth with a capital T. Now, this is not to suggest that your participants are lying to you, although there are certainly cases where they may feel your power so dominates that they need to tell you what they think you want to hear. And that is something you need to really guard against. Your participants need to feel comfortable enough to speak their truth to you. But it's also that that it's not that it's a lie. It's that if I interviewed someone, let me just take a name here, Roseanne. If I interview Roseanne, or Zanele, the next name on my list, if I interview Roseanne with the same questions and Zanele interviews Roseanne with the same questions, she's going to have got different answers, because we are different people. We present in different ways, and people bring, as much as they're bringing their experiences to you in the form of data, they're also bringing their experiences of who you are. And if they don't know you, they will project onto you what middle-aged woman, in my case. Of course, those of you who correct me and say I'm no longer middle-aged, well, there you go. Everything's subjective. But the point is that inevitably we bring ourselves into the room, and we don't just bring our own personal biases and opinions, but we also will have the biases and opinions of our participants projected onto us. And that means that there's a lot more work to be done to ensure that there's trust in the room, that there's openness, and that we're not so terrified as novice researchers to desperately just collect the data that we neglect that important work of building trust and of being worthy of that trust, so that we can get to their truth. And again, it's not just that if it was Zanele interviewing or if it was Sue McKenna interviewing that we'd get different answers. It's also just who that person is in that moment. If I interviewed Roseanne in the morning, or if I interviewed her at the end of a long day on the same topic, I might get slightly different versions of her truth. And neither of them are lies. It's just that we are dealing with this qualitative, messy, moving data. Which is part of what we've got to account for, where we justify what we found and show that these findings are worth reading and hearing about. Okay. So she's wondering if there should be, Zanelli's wondering if it should be structured or narrative inquiry. It really depends on what you're trying to get. Okay, and Mazita is using a phenomenological interview, which is a slightly different form of interview, because the idea of a phenomenological interview, and you can correct me because I'm probably going to butcher this, Mazita, but the idea of a phenomenological interview is to always, through your interviews, is to get to the essence of the phenomenon. So it's to try and kind of get rid of some of the noise and to say, well, what is the essence of this phenomenon? Which involves bracketing your own views, which I must say I find extremely difficult. I read as much as I can on the phenomenon I'm researching to try and expose myself to alternatives of understandings of the phenomenon. And I think that's hugely important, which is why I really think you need to have at least some vague draft of a literature review before you rush to collect data. And I try to use a theoretical framework that'll really allow me to see beyond my own biases. But in my view, I'm always in the room and I'm always biased. Penny is doing an online support group, Anonymous Conversations. Okay, that's an interesting one, Penny, and it sounds like an ethically interesting one, because I presume that these are perceptions on an issue that people might not want to speak about if they were not anonymous. And so that's something really important to think about as well, which is something we'll move on to shortly. Interview with the interview guide. Why? So here's a nice question. Why is qualitative data often looked down upon, especially by quantitative research? And I think that there's a long history of this, and it goes back. I wanted to say interestingly, it doesn't go back to early universities. Early universities were actually predominantly, the way knowledge was made was predominantly qualitative, with some strong, so if you have what used to be called the trivium and the quadrivium, some strong focus on astronomy, mathematics, but a huge focus on philosophy and theology. In fact, philosophy and theology were the considered the more elite subjects. I'm going back thousands of years now. But in the more recent times, since the Enlightenment, and certainly in the last 150 years or so, we have what some would critically call scientism, but certainly a view that if something can be found to be an objective external truth, it has more value. There's a lot of pushback against this, and I think qualitative research is certainly not as scorned upon as it was perhaps in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where there was a strong view that if something cannot be measured, it cannot be true. I don't think that's a very helpful answer to that question about why is qualitative research looked down upon, but it's interesting to note that there's a history to this. And in fact, you're on the upswing. We're in a phase where I think there's been some sense that while being able to measure something objectively, separate from the researcher, has enormous value, that doesn't mean that it's without subjectivity. And that's where a lot of people are raising questions about why are most top scientists, male, white, and so on, that there must be some subjectivity in the way in which science happens that's precluded active participation with swaths of people. So I think there is some good reason for some disparaging comments about qualitative research, where it's written in ways that is just it's written in very descriptive ways of, look at what these people have to say. And that is not unusual. A lot of papers get published, actually, that are what I call show and tell. Look at what I did. I did this intervention in my class. This is what my students said about it. And I'm always left with, well, so what? How does that help me understand the phenomenon? How does that help me on another side of the world? How does that help me teaching a different course or in a different university? So there is good reason why some qualitative research is dismissed as being pure show and tell, purely the views of the researcher, just describing what their participants said. The so what question, I think, can be a very valid one. But overall, I think there's an increasing understanding that we need both qualitative and quantitative research. As I always say, I want my antibiotics to be quantitative and qualitatively tested before I take them. I want the bridge that I drive upon to be quantitatively, to draw upon all the quantitative science in the world to know that that bridge will stay standing. But I also want someone to ask the qualitative questions about why is the bridge only in the wealthy area and there's no bridge in the poorer area. So we need both in this world. And I think that's important to note. Yeah, I see someone talking about mixed methods. I think that mixed methods is a very powerful way of creating very strong findings. Often people call it mixed methods. It a little bit gets my goat. I've even seen things published that are called mixed methods, which just means it's got some statistics in it. But as I said earlier, sometimes those statistics are actually just ways of capturing qualitative experiences in numbers. They're not actually measurements in an objective way. But mixed methods is not it's a great thing to do, but it requires skills in both areas. I think I'm very skilled at reading statistics. I actually did statistics at university 100 years ago. And I think it's important for any researcher, regardless of field, to be skilled at reading statistics. But I would not be skilled in actually doing statistical analyses. And so I would be loath to jump into mixed methods. So if I was to do a mixed method study, I would need to do it collaboratively. So I think sometimes students are pushed into doing mixed methods and they actually don't have the capacity to be good at it. It's true both ways. Quantitative students who are told to do a bit of qualitative, and they don't have the skills. So they end up sort of collecting some random conversations and just reporting on that without actually collecting credible, valid data and analyzing it in credible ways. So I'm not opposed to mixed method. I think it's fabulous, but I think it's asking a lot of a student, particularly at a student level. I think it's asking a lot of any researcher. I think mixed methods is fantastic in a collaborative group, but that's my view, and I'm sure it's not shared by everyone. A few ethical considerations around qualitative data, and I think you've already touched on someone in the comments. Anonymity. Yes, generally speaking, anonymity is a good thing. It gives people the courage and confidence to speak to you, knowing that they will not be identified in their study and in your study. And there's many reasons why people might not want to be identified. They might want to be critical of a colleague who's a friend of theirs or of the institution, or they might want to be critical about themselves and they don't want everyone to know that they feel a bit ashamed of something in their life. So there are many very good reasons why people may choose to be anonymous. And so I would say the default in qualitative research is to make people anonymous. Please remember, though, that if you make people anonymous, it's not just about making their name anonymous. It's about making all identifying characteristics anonymous. So I have seen two examples I can give you of studies that I've examined. The one said the institution wasn't anonymous and they kept the people anonymous, but they said the deputy dean of whatever it was, of engineering. Well, there were only 2 deputy deans of engineering in that faculty. So you haven't exactly kept them anonymous if you've told me the position they hold. Another one kept the institution anonymous, and they told me it was an institution in the Western Cape, and it was a private institution in the Western Cape, and it was a really good study. The only thing I could really say was a problem, and that I asked them to change, as the examiner, I said they must change, is that they quoted the mission statement of the institution and they analyzed it, which was really powerful. But then they cannot pretend to be keeping the institution anonymous if they quote the mission statement, because I put the mission statement into Google and I found out which institution it is. So if you want to analyze the mission statement of an institution, you cannot keep that institution anonymous. So think about what information you need to be able to tell your readers, and will that give up someone's anonymity? So you need to think carefully. There also are cases where people don't want to be anonymous. And I've argued strongly in favor of that, where there are people who are really proud of what they've gone through, and maybe their story is theirs, and they want to hold that story, and they want to have their story shared. And so they want their name used. Ethical clearance committees are often a bit nervous about this, but I would argue in favor of that. The only thing I would add to that, though, is if you're going to use someone's story with their name attached, you have to go an extra mile in terms of member checking, which is that last bullet. I'll come to it again later. But you need to, I think, if you're going to put their name to their story, they need to read what you're actually saying before you submit it for examination. Because inevitably, you are going to give your explanation of their story. You're going to be describing their story. You're going to be taking bits of their story to reach certain findings. And it's in a way easier to do that if it's anonymous, because you're taking more responsibility for being as true as you can to the story, but it's your interpretation of the story. Whereas if you've got the person's name on it, it really is a story that they are owning. And I think it's very, very important that if you are going to use your participants' names, that they need to actually read the document and you need to think through all the implications of that. I may as well just jump to member checking, because if you're going to give someone the document to read, bear in mind they are not the expert in the theory. They haven't read all the literature on the phenomenon. Your interpretation of their data may well be valid in the field, but it might not be valid for that person. And that's useful feedback. But in the end, we are not entirely self-reflexive people. I might be saying something to you and you can tell something about me that I can't tell about myself. So when we do member checking, typically what member checking is where we send the transcript to the person to say, this is the transcript of your interview. Can you just read through it and check that I've captured it all correctly? And in this day and age of AI, you're probably going to do that automatically. So the transcript will come immediately you finish the interview. And so you can get them to check that. Now, what's interesting there is oftentimes if you position this member checking in a positive way, they'll actually say, you know what, when I said such and such, I actually should have explained more. And I found that if you frame the member checking as not just, are the words okay, but are you happy with this? Is there anything more you want to add? Here's the transcript. Did you say everything you wanted to? I often find you get some additional interesting data. If, however, you use member checking in that more extensive way that I've suggested you have to do if you are using the person's actual name, which is where you actually give them your findings and you say, this is what I found, be aware that you might get pushback that you don't agree with. And you might want to stay with your findings even if they don't agree with you. And that can be a very complicated ethical and researcher kind of space to be in. Respect, really important. We go into data collection, often focused on collecting data for a paper, for a publication, for an article, for a thesis. And I think, unfortunately, that in many ways, the processes of the university position us to think that that's what we're doing. And that is incredibly ethically problematic. If we're just going in there, it's what's called extractive research in Southern theory, where you're literally going in just to extract data. And I've got my goods, thank you very much. I can get my master's, my honors, my PhD, my journal article. And without realizing the implications of building a relationship with that person. And partly it's about making clear to them that, no, you're not going to solve their water problems if you're asking them about water, so that you don't have undue expectations set up, but also that you acknowledge that they have the best experience of being them. So your job, whether you are Professor so-and-so or an honors student, your job is not to come in as the learned other and collect the data. Your job is to have the honor of spending this time learning about someone else's experience. And it's really important that in whatever way you can, you set up the interview to make that clear. That level of respect. And I use that word respect a little bit cautiously because I think that respect can look different in different places. I mean, it might come down to sort of cultural norms of whether you sort of sit on the floor, sit on a chair. It can come down to cultural norms of how you dress for the interview, but it can come to and all of those things are worth thinking through, by the way. But it also comes to bigger things of just how do you introduce yourself? How do you put the person at ease? How do you maintain some kind of link to that person after you've got your data? Will you send them a copy of your thesis? Will you send them a copy of the journal article? Will you send them a follow-up thank you email? Will you send them an email in a year's time just to say how much you appreciate them? Will you thank them in your acknowledgements? So one of the things I did in my own PhD 100 years ago is that I kept my participants anonymous, but I asked if any of them would like to be thanked in the acknowledgements by name. And because there was enough of them, people wouldn't be able to put the name in the acknowledgements with a piece of data. So some chose to be anonymous throughout, even in the acknowledgement. I could say, and thanks to the anonymous participants. And I said, and to those, and then I was able to name some of my participants. So that's another thing to do. Just a small thing to think about anonymity is, are you going to give participants a pseudonym? Are you going to allow them to choose their own pseudonym? I did something in my PhD which I regret. I interviewed lecturers and students, and the students I called student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it was. And I called the lecturers lecturer A, B, C, D, E, whatever. And in hindsight, I actually feel like that was a bit impersonal. And I wanted to be true to their experiences, and I should have given them human names rather than student 5 or whatever it was. Trustworthiness, the trustworthiness of you as a person and the trustworthiness of the stuff that you write. Are you being true to your data, as true to your data as you humanly can be? And that's again where theoretical lenses can help you to be as rigorous and true as possible. Are you being trustworthy in the way you interact with the people that are your participants? Are you perhaps subtly abusing or misusing or the data? So there are all sorts of rules around how we use direct quotes, for example, and this is really important for trustworthiness. And it's a few cases that I've had to intervene in recently where people did not understand how to use direct quotes, and they were accused of tampering with data. And just like in a laboratory, if you sort of mix some of the chemicals without including that in your methods, that would be tampering with data. It would be the same within your interviews. If you kind of put words in the person's mouth or you change it. So you need to make very clear when you give direct quotes that they're in inverted commas or they're indented to show that this is the direct words from the person. You need to be clear, have you used them verbatim? In other words, word for word, including repetitions and ums and ers and mistakes, or have you tidied them up? And you can explain the extent to which you've tidied up. And that's usually discussed in the methodology chapter, where you say, data quotes are used verbatim, including repetitions and mistakes. If the data quote is long and rambling and you only need the first bit and the end bit, you can cut out the middle bit with what's called an ellipsis, which is just 3 dots. 3 dots, not 4, not 2, 3 dots. 3 dots is called, oops, I'm doing 2, is called an ellipsis, and it literally tells the reader, the researcher has cut out a few words here. If the person says, if this person says something and you want to cut it out because it's unclear, or you want to change the wording because it's unclear, or because it's not grammatically correct, or because it gives away the identity, you use square brackets. So you might say something like, I'm just typing it in the I'm just typing that in the chat bar. I told my partner that he must leave. Now, those are the direct words of the person, but they actually said, I told Jimmy that he must leave. Now, you don't want to leave the word Jimmy in, perhaps, because you think it'll give a person's identity away. So those square brackets tell the reader the words within square brackets are me, the researcher, and I've put them in there to clarify something or to hide identity or for some other reason. So those are ways in which you try and make sure that your research is trustworthy. So you make claims about your findings. This is what emerged in your data. This is what you found. You give us a few data quotes to give us a taste of it. Those data quotes are not there to show the reader what you found. You must tell the reader what you found. But you give some data quotes as illustrative examples to add some punch, to add some flavor. And you must be true when you do that. True to the data. Positionality. Positionality is really about your position, and it's not just your position that I'm a researcher at Rhodes University, which, depending on the environment you're working into, may mean a lot and make the participant very scared and nervous of you. It might mean very little and might mean the participant doesn't even want to participate because who the hell are you? But it's going to have an effect. And as I said, your position is not just who you are in terms of your position. I'm a professor of higher education studies. I'm the director of the Centre for Postgraduate Studies. Those are my positions, but it's also my positionality in terms of, as I said earlier, I'm a woman. I'm in my late 50s. I am white. I am South African. All of that brings into the room things that can make it more or less likely that my participants feel that they can trust me, can feel that I'm respecting them, can feel that they can share their truth with me. Are they subjects? That's the common old-fashioned word. Still used in some fields, some economics and psychology field, the subject. And that's the most common term in the natural sciences when it's working with humans. So particularly in medicine, you would hear about subjects. Now, in most of the social sciences, that word is not liked because it sounds like they're just a robot, and we say, no, they're not subjects, they're participants. They are participating in my study. But I've read some interesting critiques saying, oh, we all call them participants, but are they really participants? How much are they actually participating, or are they simply giving us data? So there's some nice, interesting comments about that. Do you want to use the word subject or participant? I always use the word participant, but I'm aware of some of the critique now that I use the word participant when actually it was a once-off interview. How much participation was that? I don't know. So that's worth thinking about. And then increasingly, I have not been involved in such research, but I see people having actual collaborators, and they call them by various terms, where the researcher is definitely holding the study, doing the literature review, and setting up the data creation opportunities, but it's a collaborative endeavor to make sense of that data. And oftentimes those collaborators are actually co-authors in publications that come out of that work, because they are not simply sharing their experiences, they are working as co-researchers to make sense of those experiences. I'm aware that we're over time, so I'm going to jump to the last slide. I think it's the last slide. Collecting rich data. You want to collect rich data, rich in the sense that people feel comfortable to tell you in detail what their experiences are. You've got to remember it's not about you. So you've got to find that confidence to be able to see your main job as building trust and commitment and just a trustworthiness, showing respect. It sounds quite cynical here to put this under the heading of collecting rich data, as if the only reason you should show respect and build trustworthiness is so you can collect rich data. No, it's so that you should genuinely be a good researcher, good human being. But oftentimes I've noticed that where people are particularly anxious, nervous, they're so terrified they're not going to get the data they need for their master's, their PhD, whatever, that they rush through their questions, that they don't spend the time putting people at ease. They don't acknowledge their own vulnerability. There's a lot of power in saying, I'm very new to doing interviews, and so I hope that you're going to be patient with me. I've got some questions to get through, and I'm just so grateful that you're giving me this time. And I hope I'm not going to mess it up. So please feel free to tell me if I'm I'm not thinking through the wording very well here. But the point is that you don't have to sit there as the expert. You have to sit there as someone who is a novice researcher with gratitude and respect. And I think sometimes being vulnerable in that space can actually work in your favor. Very important to pilot. I think that if you don't, even if it's an unstructured conversational type of interview, for example, try it out with a friend, someone who in some ways maybe is similar to your participants, but not actually going to be part of your study. Try it out. If you're going to be doing questionnaires, I want to say this 500 times, pilot. Get some people to fill in the questionnaire in front of you and to talk aloud as they are doing so, because they will say, what the flip does she mean with this question? I don't even understand. And then you'll realize, oh, hang on. So encourage people to not only try out your questionnaire, but do what's called a read aloud protocol, where people do the questionnaire in front of you and ask them to speak aloud what they're thinking. And keep remembering your research questions. What are you there for? What are you collecting the data for? I would say remembering what your research problem and your research question is more important than getting your interview questions right. Of course, it's good to go into interview with some kind of idea of what questions you're going to be asking, but the most important thing is what is it that you're wanting to find out? And I think that is, yeah, I've already mentioned this, that you can't just say, here's what I found. Here's a summary of all my findings. You need to move beyond describing everything that you got through your interview, your questionnaires, your observations, and actually being able to say, look, dear reader, these are some key findings that help us to understand the phenomenon that I'm researching better. A bit rushed towards the end, but thank you so much for your time, everyone. I do see that, Ingrid, you're speaking about bringing in your own subjectivity. Wow, it's really just an ongoing battle, and something I get wrong all the time. But I think it's about being constantly reflective and constantly reading. Read about your phenomenon and see how other people have made sense of it. And then, yes, there will be a recording. It's going to be on YouTube. And then finally, please scroll up to the link that Olwetu has put in. He's just put it in again, which is an evaluation form. We really appreciate these things because we want to make sure we give sessions that are useful to you, and we don't want to repeat ones that aren't useful. So just follow the evaluation link, please, and just give us a few pointers as to what you need. Joy, hello. I didn't even know you were here. I see your hand is up. Hi, Joy. I know we're over time, so those of you who have to leave, feel free to do so. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Joy?
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute. Good afternoon, Prof.
Hey, Joy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask this question. How do you carry out a quantitative analysis with text, literally text? What we do in literary text is qualitative analysis. So how do you carry out a quantitative analysis with literary text? Thank you so much.
Okay, right. So I should have mentioned document analysis. I didn't once mention document analysis, and that's a really useful qualitative study. What are the main discourses in this policy, for example? What are the main literary themes in this novel? So certainly very common to look for the qualities embedded in a document. Quantitative analysis, I think there can be so many different methods depending on what your research question is. Certainly in linguistics, there would be many quantitative analyses. You might want to do an analysis of the number of hedges that are used by different speakers, or the number of repetitions, or the number of, is it called emic devices? And so you're using measurements in order to make statements about the flow of the document or the power of the speaker, or I don't know, because I don't know the question. But I would suggest there are others, and particularly in the world of online data analysis, these big databases often do analyses of word counts, and the use of a certain word. So those kind of quantitative analysis of words is also common. I mean, Google Analytics is really useful if you've ever played around with Google Analytics to have a look at what are the most common search phrases in certain countries or at certain times, or has a certain word been searched for more or less over certain times, and so on. Sorry, Joy, you wanted to give me some more clarity?
No, thank you so much. I'm fine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. A question about a guide about how to edit quotes, ellipsis and brackets. I'm not sure. I think if you Google for representation of direct quotes and qualitative data, you might come up with something. I don't know of any handy guide that's available. If I read documents, I'm looking at James's question now. If I read documents and use what I get there to back up what I collect elsewhere, Is the review of documents called document analysis? Ah, nice question, James. Now, in every study, you're going to be looking at documents, right? Because it's part of your literature review. What have other people said about this phenomenon? And most of what they've said about this phenomenon is going to be captured in documents. So I would not call that a document analysis. I would call that a literature review or a conceptual framework where you're trying to demonstrate how certain concepts or ideas have been understood in the literature in the field. I would not call that a document analysis. But if you have a document that you are actually analyzing to reach a finding from that document, I would call it document analysis. So that document is now no longer part of the general conversation which you're bringing to your data, but it is actually your data. You are analyzing that document, and it's not uncommon to have interviews and document analysis, but that would be separate from just oftentimes when you discuss your findings about your interviews, you might reference certain readings to show how that echoes with something you read in the literature or how that contradicts something you read in some document. That's not a document analysis. That's bringing the literature into conversation with your findings. But if you actually take a document and analyze that document using some tool or another, when I say tool, I mean like discourse analysis or linguistic counts or whatever, then I would call that a document analysis, because you're taking the document, you're analyzing it, and you're reaching findings about that document rather than simply using that document to talk back to your findings. Hope that made sense. Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time, and thanks for being here.